Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lucia Melloni. She is a research leader of the Neuroscience, Consciousness and Cognition Group at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. Her research areas include domain general cortical computations, neural mechanisms by which the brain predictively controls sensory processing and perception, brain mechanisms subserving language comprehension, and possibilities and limits of brain plasticity to restore cognitive functions. So, Dr. Melloni, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Ricardo, for giving me the opportunity to join you today.
So let's start by talking about consciousness. How do you understand and how do you approach consciousness from a neuroscientific perspective?
Mm-hmm. Let me start first by perhaps bringing up what the problem is.
Okay.
Because sometimes, whenever somebody studies consciousness, or I've encountered very often the situations where people say, like, what do you study? And this is, and I think part of the problem is because consciousness is so intimate to us that sometimes we're blind to its existence and to what the problem is. And so the way in which I think about it is, what is consciousness is just the fact that we have experiences, and this is, you can think of from experiencing the pain of a sharp needle when you have a jab, for a vaccine, or when you are enthusiastic about something and you're very happy. So all of those experiences. The problem is that all of those are internal to us. So as much as I know, for instance, that every morning when I wake up, I am conscious, and when I fall asleep and I have no dreams, I am kind of like not there. If I have to investigate it on you, it's much more difficult. Right? And this is the idea of this subjectivity gap, which is that I know consciousness exists for me. Like I don't need any measurement device. Like I know it every day. Like I can tell you like now that I am conscious. But if I have to say, like, are you conscious? I will have to make an inference, right? Based on your behavior, based on what you say, and so on. So, and this is the conundrum that very often we face as scientists. We know that the phenomenon exists, it's intimate to us, but yet investigating it in others and knowing that others have it is not that easy. And I will give you one experience that I have 20 years ago that made me understand why is it so difficult to do it, right? The partner of my sister had an accident at the time, and he was declared brain dead. So what? And there's a very disconcerting situation, because when you are declared brain dead, people put you in all of these machines. You have all of these ventilators and so on. You are warm, so it seems as if I look at you, you are there, right? There is somebody there. Like, yet the medicine tells you that there is nobody there, right? And in very few cases, you can have the experience of the so-called like Lazarus phenomenon, which is that people move. It's not a very, it's more like an automatic move. It's more like a reflex. But nonetheless, imagine that, you say, like, look, I mean, there is somebody who is dead, but it's moving. Like, you understand the conundrum, right?
Right.
And then and on that very same night, I realized I am also a lucid dreamer, which means that, like you kind of like wake up into your dreams. And on that night, I realized I was having these dreams, with him, and I started to control what was happening. And I thought, this is super interesting, because how would you know, as an external observer, who of us is conscious, right? He is in a hospital bed, he's moving. I am in my bed, I am not moving, right? So how would you know? That is the problem, you see? And so the issue is that behavior in and of itself is not enough, because if you were to go by behavior only, you would say he was aware, he was conscious, he was moving. I was not. I was paralyzed, right?
Right.
So, and that is the problem, how we investigate that, because we know that it exists, yet behavior in and of itself is not enough, right? Now, we nonetheless, the best that we do at these days is relying on behavior very often, So we confront subjects with images, sometimes they see it, sometimes they don't, and we ask them to give us a report. And the report can be either they will tell us like, yes, I see it, yes, I don't, or they will press a button, or they will move their eyes. But there is very often a motor component, being it saying or moving your finger, etc. So this is how we study it, but it's not perfect, right? Because of what I just told you. In a sense, we are in occasions we're underestimating certain capacities, right? And this becomes much more relevant when you're looking at, people who actually don't speak, like babies, right? Or may not actually have, like they are unresponsive. So what happens, for instance, with patients that are in a vegetative state or are unresponsive? Like, how do you know, right? So that is the problem that we have as scientists in some sense, right? We know that our methods are not perfect.
Right. But when it comes to the neuroscience of consciousness, what are the approaches there to study, let's say, consciousness in the brain? I know that, for example, there's a line of research with the so-called neural correlates of consciousness. That's something that many philosophers of mind, for example, also talk about. So tell us about it, how basically neuroscientists find correlates of consciousness in the brain.
Yeah. So consciousness was kind of like a forbidden word during the behaviorism, part of science, right? So, nobody would investigate consciousness because nobody had seen it, nobody has touched it, like you would say, like, I'm not gonna investigate this, right? So until say like the 80s, there was almost no research whatsoever. Then in the 90s, Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, they proposed a framework to investigate consciousness. And they say, like, let's just leave the so-called like hard problem of consciousness aside, which is like, how could matter create this or be able to substantiate consciousness? And they say, like, let's just focus on something much more, not necessarily mundane, but much simpler, which is like, what are the simple correlates? Right, and then the idea here was that this is a simpler program. So as I said, you put a subject, for instance, you show a subject an image. Sometimes they see it, sometimes they don't, and you acquire, for instance, some measure of brain activity through, say, magnetoencephalography. You would get an electrical response, or through electroencephalography, you will also get an electrical response, or through functional magnetic resonance imaging, you would get a spatial response. What is the patterns of brain areas that actually gets activated, right? And what we have been doing ever since is having and scientists have become actually fairly good. Like psychologists are developing paradigms by which you can hide a stimulus from consciousness, right? So you can either present a sound and then mask it, such that then the subjects don't hear it, right? Or you can create a touch, and sometimes that you do it in such a way that you mask it again, and then subjects don't perceive it, right? So the trick is always find sort of like a contrast between a conscious state and an unconscious state. In this case, an image that you see, an image that you don't see, or a sound that you hear, a sound that you don't hear, and measure some kind of brain activity at the same time. And then the program is, if you do a simple subtraction between these two, then you would say whatever is left in the brain or in the brain activity or in the patterns of waveforms is what reflects consciousness, right? That was kind of like the hope of the research program. Now, what happens in the past 30 years was that psychologists, got very excited, right? So then they did it, with attentional brain paradigms, which is one form of hiding stimulus, with, like masking, binocular rivalry, you name it. Like, we have been doing this with fMRI, magnetoencephalography, EMG, electrocorticography. And the picture, what would have imagined that over time, we would have converged on a set of areas, on a set of activities that are responsible for consciousness, right? I think it's reasonable to assume that, right? So if you do more research, then you will find, like, what is the Holy Grail?
Right.
But what happened in the past 30 years was mostly that we found too many correlates. And that if you put all of that picture together, it like it's not that easy to say that you have a simple and clear one image of, like those findings. And the problem was that the methods that we had, the so-called like constructive method, was not perhaps suited for purpose. And I will explain you why. What we discovered over the years was that this logic of subtracting a conscious state from an unconscious state is true if you have if the premise of pure insertion holds, which means that the only thing that you change is consciousness, right? But imagine that, for instance, you get to see a stimulus because you are more alert, right? Or because you have a set of expectations. Right. Those precursors will also be a part of the brain response, right? And when you do a subtraction, those precursors will also be somewhat, conflating your proper response to the neural correlates, right? So this is what happens, like what we call like the antecedents. Now you can also think that what happens is that there's consequences. So, for instance, if you are conscious, perhaps you lay down episodic memory, and you only do that when you are conscious. If this is true, so if conscious does something in information processing terms, this means that, of course, it's not going to be the same being in a conscious state when not being in a conscious state. So then when you subtract, you also get the consequences, right? Yeah. So now, if you put all of the findings together, then you get the NCC proper plus the NCC precursors plus the NCC consequences. And that's what we think is messing up the picture, right? Because we're getting much more than what we initially had hoped for, right? So now we are developing methods that hopefully will be able to distill, as we call it, the NCC. So how can we remove those confounding factors? How can we remove the consequences, and how can we remove the precursors? And the hope is that by doing that systematically, one would converge onto what is only the neural correlates in and of itself, right? That's the hope of a program that is more like a bottom-up program. So you start from the data and then you try to come up with a theory, right? It's kind of like an induction process, right?
Right.
But it's limited, right? You can also think of perhaps a better way, which is, or not a better way, but an alternative way, in which you say, what if I start from a theory? And then I derive predictions, and then I see whether those checked in the data. So now the newer approaches are actually trying to do that. So starting now, it's more like a deduction process, not an induction where you start from the data and then you hope that the theory to emerge, but you start from the theories themselves. You try to create predictions and then see in the data where those predictions were borne out or not.
Is the hard problem of consciousness, as philosophers defined it, something that scientists, neuroscientists specifically, are interested in trying to solve or not?
I would say yes. Except that we all agree that it's a very difficult problem, right? So the idea of Christoph Koch and Francis Crick in that piece was not to say that the hard problem was not interesting, but it was more to say, what if we start making progress on an easier problem, and if we start understanding it better, perhaps we will be better positioned to really tackle the hard problem, right? So I think that if you ask every scientist, of course, we want to understand, why is consciousness here? Who has it? Which animals have it? Where does it go away when we sleep? Where does it go? Right? We are the same biological machine, right? So it's not that like suddenly like you're made out of stones when you fall asleep. No, it's the same neurons, it's the same body, and yet consciousness is not there, right? So we are all trying to understand it, but it's a hard problem.
It's in the name.
It's a difficult problem to solve. So there hasn't been many attempts, with the exception of perhaps there is a theory called integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi, and they are trying to make headways into solving the problem of qualia, which means like why phenomenological experience feels the way it does. So for instance, they have now some recent studies and a recent theoretical proposal as to why and how we feel space the way we do, extended, unified, and so on, right? Now those are fairly recent attempts, right? So it's a fairly new field if you think about it, right? So it's only 30 years if you discount the time that we were not allowed to talk about consciousness because nobody has seen it, touching it, right?
Yeah, the behaviorists really were complicated people to deal with, I guess.
Right.
So, and what about consciousness having some sort of causal power over our behavior? Because that's another big question, not only in neuroscience, but also in philosophy of mind, psychology. I guess we can even say behavioral science in general. So do we know anything about that? I mean, does it have any causal power over our behavior? Is it just epiphenomenal?
Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, there's many views in philosophy as to what could be the relationship between consciousness and matter in some sense, right? You can think of. So some of them think that it's an epiphenomenal. So you live in your conscious mind, and then your matter is completely detached from it, right? And when people have tried to investigate that, for instance, if you take there's an experiment that Libet did, some decades ago, trying to look for what, can we find evidence for free will, right? Meaning that can I be, am I just subjected to my brain, to the powers of my brain, or does my experience in and of itself is separated from the mere physical activity, right? So he devised a fairly interesting task where you would be looking at a clock, and then you would be deciding at a particular time when to move your finger, and then you had to memorize in your mind at what position of the arrows you actually were you made your decision, right? And they were collecting at the same time EEG activity, electroencephalography, right? And so what they found out is that the time at which you declare that you made your decision is anteceded by activity in your brain that predicts what you're going to do. So the idea here would be that, well, you seem to actually be in some way dominated by your brain because your brain has decided before you had the experience, right? So that would account for a conscious completely epiphenomenal in some sense, right? So it doesn't have any causal powers, right? There has been, of course, like a number of criticism to that particular task, and new evidence points out to the fact that perhaps it's not necessarily fair to do it that way. So the jury is out. Like there is, like in synthesis, there is beliefs both ways. Some people think that it's epiphenomenal. Some people think that it's not, and both lines of thought are working towards finding, proper evidence and arguments that justify one or the other, right? So Francisco Varela, for instance, was one of those that he was talking about how could it be that consciousness affects the brain, and he was talking about the idea of downward causation. So if you think of a physical system, there is like a global set of parameters, and he was actually thinking that those global set of parameters reflect consciousness, and those global set of parameters can in fact affect the system in and of itself. So this would be one way in which you can think of in physical terms, that consciousness and the state of your mind can have an effect on your behavior. And so my take is that it has to have it some way. Otherwise it would be kind of like weird that we have this, right? But this doesn't necessarily have to be. You can also think of a system in which these two properties may have evolved independently, right? It could just be so the case that in humans and in the species that we know, they just co-evolve, right? So then every time we are conscious, then that actually does cause, that does confer with certain extra capacities, right? And in fact, I think that like Larissa Albantakis, she has done some modeling work looking at, for instance, what is the relationship between consciousness and intelligence. Because you can also think that these two are independent, right? You can think that, you know, a highly conscious being can also be highly intelligent, but it doesn't have to be, right? So she did some modeling work where she demonstrated that it seems that these two properties tend to co-evolve. So therefore, it happens to be the case that those, you know, like species that are conscious, they also tend to be smart, right?
Right.
But in the case of, but sorry, go ahead.
And so in that case, they would have co-evolved, or would consciousness be sort of a prerequisite for intelligence?
It doesn't have to be a prerequisite, but you can. This in Larissa's work, you know, the idea is that in some sense it's, you know, you don't pay a price for in some sense, and then they can actually there could be potential advantages, right? And because of that, they are selected for together, right? But this doesn't mean necessarily that it has to be that way, right? You can also think of computers, perhaps, that, you know, like now, let's assume that computers are not conscious. They are actually fairly smart in a small domain, right? So when we actually talk about, you know, artificial, you know, machines, perhaps these two don't have to be together. It could just be that in biological systems they actually tend to go together.
Yeah, I understand. So talking about the specific aspect of our psychology that connects to consciousness, or at least manifests consciously, you do work on conscious perception. So how does it work?
What do we do? Yeah. So we are interested in many, well, of course, we're interested in trying to find out the neural correlates of consciousness. So what in the brain, you know, consciousness resides, and what kind of activity it, you know, what kind of activity actually gives rise to consciousness, right? To do that, we have done many different studies on different domains. So one of those is, back in the day, we did experiments on the so-called like masking. So what you do is you present one image, then you present a stimulus afterwards, and if the temporal succession between one and the other is very short, then your perception is kind of like replaced by the stimulus that comes after, right? So, you know, by just separating these two stimuli, you can either see the first one or not, right? And we looked and we worked in the past with those sort of paradigms, so-called like masking paradigms, looking at what kind of temporal dynamics could reflect consciousness. And we were working on the hypothesis that synchronization between neurons, and in this case, long-range synchronization, could be a potential mechanism for consciousness. Why we thought it was an interesting mechanism? Because of the following. So on the one hand, we think we know that consciousness is unified, right? So if you have an experience of this particular moment, you cannot say that, you know, you are separating myself from the background or from the sound that comes out of my mouth. It all happens at once, and this is the moment. This is what it is in your consciousness, right? Right. Yet in your brain, those signals are actually processed in different areas. So it's going to be B4 that will be doing color, B5 that will be doing motion, B1 that will be doing, you know, like orientations or, you know, spatial frequencies. Then you would have auditory cortex that will be doing the sound. So this poses the question: how are all of those signals converging and synchronized at the same time, such that they are in your consciousness, right? That was so. And therefore, we thought, well, perhaps one possibility is that the neurons in all of those different areas synchronize, and that's what gives rise to this percept, to this conscious percept. Why it would also be that interesting is because you also you need to account for what happens in your mind when you are not conscious of the same content, right? So there is situations where we also know that there's the so-called like unconscious perception, which actually seems to be fairly robust in some ways, and it can also lead to, in some accounts, to very deep processing of information, right? Though that's also the jury's out there in terms of, you know, how vast the unconscious processing really is. But let's assume for the moment that there is unconscious processing. One is to also account for how come that the very same neurons sometimes are conscious and sometimes are not, right? So the idea was, back in the day, that it was because of the synchronization. So if those very same neurons are synchronized among each other, then you're conscious, and if they aren't, then you're not, right? And the next reason why we thought that the desynchronization could be a potential mechanism is also because the brain needs its composition, in the sense that you can have multiple experiences, gazillions of forms of experiences, right? Yet you have a finite set of neurons, right? And you need to account for all of the experience and its configuration and its relations that they have, right? So we thought, okay, that's another way in which you can actually account for the compositionality, because now you have the same set of neurons, but if a pair synchronizes, then that becomes part of your consciousness. If they are not synchronized, then they are not part of your consciousness. And now, depending on which set of neurons, is all of the multiple configurations that you may have, right? So that's one example of the experiments that we did in the past to try to look for consciousness, right? We also did other studies, for instance, also looking at meditation, right? Because there is not only, you can think that the way in which we experience is one, but there is also ways in which we can change the way in which we experience, right? And meditation is one of those. So in some accounts, and with some sort of meditation, the meditators declare that they can, for instance, see the so-called like the leaves and the forest, meaning that they can see the local details as well as the global image. Very often we are not that way. So you either see the forest or you see the leaves, but it's very hard for us to see both, right?
Yeah.
So they claim that because they have trained their attention focus, then they can do that, right? So we're looking at ways in which you can also change your perception through these practices, right? And meditation was one interesting because it seems also fairly, it's on the one hand it speaks for plasticity, the fact that you can train your brain, but also it generalizes. It means that you do meditation, it generalizes to how you see objects, how you experience sounds, which for many other trainings that actually doesn't happen. So fairly often you train on one thing and the benefits are only seen in that particular domain. If you then change the stimuli or you change the domain, the benefits are gone, right? So we were looking at, are there ways in which we can train our perception in ways that are also generalizable, right?
And do you have results on that? I mean, is it possible to really do what the meditators claim they are able to do?
Yeah. So it was a very interesting research back in the day, because we looked at two things. So meditators claim that they can perceive more things at the same time in the spatial domain, but they also claim that they can resolve a stimuli in time in a better way. So in this case, what we did was, first we looked at an attentional blink task. And what happens in the attentional blink is that if I present you a succession of stimuli, one after the other, like around 100 milliseconds each, and then I ask you to pay attention to one, because you pay attention to one, then you tend to miss the ones that happen after in a particular temporal span, around 300 milliseconds or so, right? So we know that, and this is the idea of the attentional blink. So your attention is grabbed and then you blink on the next stimuli that actually comes, and you don't see them, right? And what we found out, and we presented this task to college students, which we do know that have a very large attentional blink. We present this to elderlies, which we know that have an even larger attentional blink. And we present this to old participants that actually had been trained on meditation. Okay. And the result was really interesting, because what we observed is that those subjects that were old outperformed the neurotypical young people. So they actually it seems that their subjective experience that they can perceive more in time is true. They tend to actually see and resolve the stimuli in time in a much better way. But this was more like a behavioral study, so we didn't know what happens in their brain. So we follow up with another study where we did, in this case, the so-called global local task. So imagine that I write you a letter, like imagine that the letter H, and I can write it in small h, but you can write it in small o's, for instance, right? And then I ask you to tell me, like, okay, detect when you see an O or detect when you see an H, right?
Okay.
So if the O was the large letter, imagine that you have an O large and very small H, you will have an advantage to see the O because it's the global shape. The idea is that we tend to first see the forest and then the leaves, right? So and this is something very typical. Like for most subjects, if you run the so-called global local task or the precedence task, and you ask them like to detect the stimulus either in the global shape or in the smaller shape, they tend to respond significantly faster to the global shape. We ask meditators to do exactly the same task. Either meditators that have gone to a 4-day training, or to long-term meditators, these were like Zen monks that were training on meditation. And in this case, what we did is that they were doing the task while we were also collecting EEG activity, and EEG responses. And what we observed, like behaviorally, first of all, was that meditators could detect the global and the local form equally well, and they were on top of that faster than the normal one that actually had not meditated. Because you could say, well, perhaps you detect the global and the local forms, but because you are slower, right? No, they were actually faster on. So they were in fact behaviorally much better than us, right? And then we look into their brain responses to see what is the difference in their brain responses. And what we observe is that what we think is that, or we interpret the result this way, is that the brain waves tend to actually switch between global and local at a much faster pace in their brain. So it's not that they are processing these stimuli at the same time, but it's the fact that they can actually switch between them much faster. And because they can do that, then of course they process them, like at the same time, behaviorally, so to speak, and actually much faster, right? So through that research, I kind of like convinced myself that meditation does something to our brain, and it does confer certain advantages. We could never see disadvantages because one could also say, well, if you gain something, is it that you lose something at the same time? Right? Right. We have not observed that, but it's still theoretically possible, right?
And since we're talking about perception, how does early experience influence it?
Early experience as in childhood, you mean, or
yes, in childhood.
Yeah. So here's one particular case where it's very easy to notice how childhood, influence experience. So we are born with the capacity to perceive and to produce every phoneme, because a child doesn't know in which culture or in which country is going to be born and which language we'll have to learn, right? So at the beginning, babies, very young age, they are sensitive to all of the different phonemes in the phonetic repertoire. But as they grow in a particular culture, they gain the separability between some, and they lose the separability between others. So for instance, I grew up in Chile. I am a Spanish speaker, and if you ask me to detect the difference between a V and a V, I cannot even produce it, So, which is very disconcerting because, for every other culture or for every other language, it's like, how come? Like, you don't hear the difference. It's like, no, I don't. To the point that, like in when you train kids to learn, you say, oh, burro is written with a B big. Vaca is written with a B small. And that's how you map the sounds with the graphemes, right? But if you ask me to listen to it, like, if I have to do a phoneme discrimination between a V and a V, so I have no idea. So here's a very good example whereby your early experience, your early childhood determine the way in which you experience, right? And what is interesting is that because as much as so for instance, I English is not my first language, it's my second language, And then, of course, I could learn the vocabulary. I could learn the grammar, but I could not learn the phonetic forms. You see? And that's something that happens to all of us, there's certain sounds that we just don't hear, right?
Right. And since you're talking about language, does your research on language connect to, for example, consciousness in any way?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, as I told you, partly because of this experience that I had, like many years ago with this person that was declared brain dead, I've been obsessed with, can we find a way to communicate or to determine whether someone is there without asking them? Because we started this conversation by, we always have to ask, right? I have to ask, are you conscious, right? Did you see this? Did you see that? But what if you cannot move, right? So what we did many years ago was to devise a technique by which you can so-called frequency tag your brain as you are understanding language. This may sound weird. It's not. It's actually very simple. So as you are processing language in this moment, for instance, your brain is being activated to these different units, to the phonemes, to the syllables, to the sentences, to the words, and so on, right? And the question was, so if this is true, then this means that if I present language, not like now where I'm speaking like faster or slower, but at a particular rate. So imagine that I present 4 words, each of them is for last 150 milliseconds, but then 2 of them form a phrase. Now a phrase would be 500 milliseconds, a second phrase would be another 500 milliseconds. And imagine that now each of those phrases I compound in a sentence. Then this means that a sentence would actually last a second. Right?
Okay.
So now you will have the words going for, like 4 per second, the phrases 2 per second, and the sentences 1 per second, right? So now you actually have a frequency, right? At which, this stimuli in the world appear, right? Now, the thing is that they actually don't appear in the world, they appear in your mind, because if I show you a stimulus that has exactly the same acoustic properties, but you don't know the language, then the only thing that you will see is the so-called words or phonemes. Why? Because there is transitions in there's changes in amplitude as a function of the syllables. But of course, there's no changes in amplitude as a function of the words or the sentences or the phrases. This is something that you put in your head because you created language, right? So because we know that now these high order units that reflect language, it can be, and we can create materials that are in a particular frequency. Then we ask subjects to lay, in this case, either in the EMG, which is a fancy like machine that measures your brain activity, or in the EEG. And so what happens is that now you have very nice and neat responses at each of these frequencies. So 1 hertz for the sentences, 2 hertz for the words, for the phrases, and 1 hertz and 4 hertz for the words. And because we know that this, and we have replicated this across many different languages, we know that if you don't speak the language, those same frequencies don't exist. So we can really know what happened. Then we did, so now you can use these, then ask somebody who cannot communicate. So you just put an EEG, you put them these sentences, and then you see whether or not their brain responds or not, right? And this is what we did. And this was my way to kind of like try and get a measurement of, you can't say that it's somebody's consciousness because it's not really, but at least is their capacity to experience language, which is already a capacity that is fairly complex, right? And so we could demonstrate that in patients that are unresponsive, those that had it's an interesting experiment because these are patients that had a traumatic brain injury. They're lying in the ICU, so in the ER, and by all medical means, they appear unconscious. So they don't respond, they don't have any of these reflexes that you expect. So the doctors will say they are, there's nobody there, right? That's what the current medicine will tell you.
Right. So
we did this experiment where we put the EEG, very cheap, 20 minutes, we play these sounds, right? And then we can actually see like how many of those, patients, we studied 30, actually had these responses of the language. and a handful of them had, right? And then we could track them, like what happens to those patients 6 months later, right? Because in principle, if you had access, if your brain was responding to language, then you could say you have a far better prognosis than the ones that actually their brains were completely flat.
Right.
And this is exactly what happened. So we could predict much better than even with the brain scans that the patients will gain consciousness 6 months later, right? So this is where my research on language and my research on consciousness kind of like tie together, right? And partly because like I think that one of the biggest mysteries in language is meaning, which I think that it relates to consciousness, like why we have meaning, like meaning doesn't exist in the world, it exists in your mind.
Right.
You see? So that's the part that fascinates me, where I think that like consciousness and language, just they intertwine in some sense. They connect.
Right. And do you already have any answer to that? I mean, basically where meaning comes from.
I would love to. No. We're working on that, but that is a much more difficult thing to do. So we were doing fun experiments this day. I have a fantastic, like postdoc, two of them who are actually working on a very fun experiment where what we're doing is that we're showing images like our comics to people, and in these comics images, you can have like implied actions. Imagine that, like I throw you a ball, you kind of like, you are able to extract or infer that there is an action, that there is a patient, there is an action, there is an agent, and you can also do the same thing in language. You don't see the same stimuli, but you read a story. And now we're trying to, and while the subjects are listening to these stories or they are seeing these images, we are extracting a magnetoencephalography. And then we're trying to see like what is the similarity between seeing and listening a story, because in principle both tap on the so-called like conceptual system. You in both cases understand the action, even though the medium by which you understood that is very different, right? So these are the kind of experiments, but we are really in the beginnings, like we know that is as big of a problem as I think as trying to understand consciousness itself.
Yeah, I imagine. But still, within the domain of language, is it that the brain regions responsible for language processing have already been mapped or not?
Well, depends on what you mean by map. So what we do know from lesion studies already, the so-called Tapetion or Broca's or Wernicke's area, is that and you may have heard of those, is that depending on which one of those areas is affected, either Broca, which is in the front, or Wernicke, which is in the back, in the posterior part of the brain, you either lose the expressivity of language or the capacity to comprehend language, right? So in a sense, like it was known from like a century ago that these areas are relevant. Now the hard work is to try and understand what are those areas truly doing, right? Because when you say that you don't understand language, like the question is like, what part you do not understand? Like, is it that you're not processing the sounds, and because of that you're not understanding language, or is it because like you do process the sounds but you don't put them together? And because of that, you actually learn language. You lose language, or because like you lose the connection between the sound and the word forms and the concept. These all produce different sort of deficits, right? And with the advent of neuroimaging, now of course we can image the responses in the brain to language much better, right? And what is nice. And what is nice at the same time and a little bit disconcerting is that if you do, for instance, functional magnetic resonance imaging, very often you get the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain activated. But we know that if you have a lesion in your right side, you don't lose language. It's mostly if you actually have a lesion in the left side of your brain. You see, so this tells you that it's an interesting pattern to work on, but it's difficult. So we know roughly the cortical territory related to language, but what each region does and how the information flows, it's something that we haven't cracked yet.
Okay. So for the last part of this interview, I would like to ask you a little bit more about brain plasticity, because in recent decades, we've been hearing a lot about it. But what is really brain plasticity? When we talk about it, what kinds of, let's say, processes are we really talking about, and what are its limits?
Yeah. So I think that's a fascinating question, because in the past, there were a lot of ideas that, we were born one way and that the capacity to change was fairly limited. So there was this notion of a critical period. So, for instance, what I just mentioned with the phonemes, like by age 1, if you're exposed to one language or another, then you will acquire certain forms of phonemes. There's also the idea that that if you don't expose kids to language, and they also don't necessarily develop the proper language in terms of the syntactic properties, in terms of the semantic properties, right? So in a sense, there was this notion that there is this critical period, so times at which if you are not exposing a subject, then you lose the full function. And also there was the notion that if you get older, you only lose capacity, you never gain. Kind of like as if we start knowing nothing, we're tabula rasa, then we start learning, then at some point we become genius, and then from then on there's only like a downhill. we only get bad, right? Which is not a bad notion. I think we do know that of course there is a point that we have a cuspid and we are very good, and then at some point we can do better. But our research was trying to look at, are there ways, are there limits to that? So for instance, could one say that you see something now and that your perception threshold, your capacity to see, is stable, right? And we actually ran experiments to demonstrate that's not the case. I can train you to see many more things,
Okay.
Now, and when we're confronted in that research is that you can do the so-called perceptual learning task. So if I train you to see, for instance, always like a particular spatial frequency, then you become much better at distinguishing between two different spatial frequencies. But you do it, for instance, like in this part of the visual field. Then what was happening is that I train you doing that, you become really, really good, you're much better, and then I move the stimuli here, and it's gone. So it kind of like it was at the same time, it was on the one hand interesting because it shows us that we can change. It was also disappointing because it said, look, it's the transfer, the capacity to move from one to the other is fairly limited. And that's why we then moved to other sort of forms of training, like for instance meditation, right? Because in those, it seems that those subjects do not train on a specific stimulus, and because they don't do a specific stimulus, so the set of stimulus over which they train their attention or their perception is so much more variable that perhaps because of that, now they are much more able to then transfer to other new situations. And that's what we actually saw. So I think that through that research, I've convinced myself that there is a capacity for brain plasticity, and that is retained. And now the interesting questions are like, how can we make it transferable and generalizable? Because that's what we would want. Like you wouldn't want to, like, if I imagine that I trained you on typing on a particular keyboard, but then I give you another keyboard and you cannot do it, right? Yeah. Like that, it's okay, but it's a little bit disappointing, right? So now what we're trying to do is more like finding the set of parameters or the set of training regimes that would enable subjects to transfer from one context to another context, right? Yeah. So and there is also research that I haven't done, but I keep an eye on, which I also find interesting, is that it's all of the benefits of exercise. In terms of like what the changes that happens in the hippocampus. So I think that there's a lot of there's a renewed interest and also renewed research showing that our brain seems to be much more plastic and far less stable than we thought. So, which is good news in some sense, I would say.
Yeah. And does that plasticity apply specifically to some functions that you study, like language, for example? I mean, earlier you even mentioned critical periods for learning. I mean, with what we know nowadays, do those critical periods still make sense, for example?
You know, they still make sense. So there is, I think it's undeniable that, say, if I expose you to different languages as a kid, you will profit much more than if I do it much later on. So that is undeniable. So there is that. I think that what we're trying to demonstrate is to say, even if those those moments at which you can profit the most are there, this doesn't mean that you are doomed to fail at any other point. So what we're trying to say is that there is still room for improvement. And yes, it's going to be much more costly. It's going to be much more difficult than if you actually do it at the very beginning, but still possible. And that's what we're trying to convey. It's more like, if you want, like this more optimistic view that yes, it's going to be hard work, to change, but you can change. That's the perhaps like the one sentence summary that research shows.
And what about brain plasticity when it occurs between, let's say, different modalities? Because I've read some research, for example, people who have some damage in their temporal lobe, I think, that processes auditory sensory input, and then their visual cortex is able to some extent to pick up some of that function and vice versa, but there are certainly limits to that as well.
Correct. Yes. And this is exactly the question that we have. So for instance, if you have a stroke as a kid, your brain will adapt that much more easily than if you do that as an adult. Right. So that or if you have, like, for instance, epilepsy, and then you have to, resect an area in the brain, the brain will adapt much more easily if this happens in early childhood, right? Now the question exactly now is, like, how can we? What are the limits for that, and what are the training regimes that actually are conducive to more plasticity than others, right? And there is, like, now recent research, like, also looking at drugs, like, for instance, antidepressant drugs, that seems to destabilize the brain in such a way that it mimics this kind of like critical periods, or it puts the brain in a much more malleable way, right? So this is all new research with, I think part is sparkled by the idea that there seems to be the capacity to restart this malleability in the brain, right? And now the question is, like, how to do it and how to make it also, put that in such a way that you also don't generate interference, right? Because you can also think, like, okay, because you learned, like, this we were discussing before, like, it's great to, through meditation to do something better, but what if through that you do something worse? So there's the need to have balance, so, like, acquiring new capacity will not overrule or overwrite another capacity, right? So
yeah, I mean, I've been asking you a lot about the limits of neuroplasticity because, as you know, over the past few decades, not necessarily scientists themselves, but some popular writers sometimes tend to overhype what neuroplasticity can deliver, and sometimes it seems limitless. Some people perhaps present the information, it seems like you can recover any kind of cognitive capacity or whatever kind of capacity through neuroplasticity. But I mean, there's good science on that, but I guess that we have to be a little bit more careful when presenting the information, particularly to the general public, because sometimes it might be at least a bit misleading. Right?
Absolutely. And the truth is that much more often than not, it does not work. Right? So this doesn't mean that even though I was trying to give you this idea of, there's positive hope, Like imagine the research that I was just showing you before, right? I trained you on this and you become much better, but then I put the stimulus here and then, you lose it. Yes, there is plasticity, but that shows that it's actually fairly limited, right?
Right.
So I concur with you on this idea that one needs to be much more careful as to how to convey those results, because while they are still interesting in and of themselves, and I think that they provide us with a good tool to continue investigating why that happens and under which circumstances, and then try to promote that. It's also the case that they are not perfect, right? So there is a ton of limitations of those, and you will not learn like a language during your sleep. You do it once. So this kind of magic techniques, they just don't work, right? So I completely share your sentiment that one needs to also be realistic as to how much we are able to do these days, right? Which is more than what we used to do, but just is great by no means.
I mean, not to say that in the future we couldn't do more or better, just to be realistic about the point we're at the moment.
Absolutely. So I think it's important that this is what the message I was trying to convey. So I think that the results point in the right direction, means that they say that it is possible to regain certain capacities, and that is a really good and positive message. Now, it's also true at the same time that that is only works or seem to work under a very limited set of constraints, and the question is which are those, right?
Yeah. So just one last question then. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the work you're doing now or will be doing in the near future?
Sure. I have only one thing that I would like to share with you that we didn't get to talk to, but it's related to my work on consciousness that we are doing recently. It's a fairly large project where we are doing the so-called open science adversarial collaboration. What that means is that, as I mentioned to you before, we don't really quite know what are the brain processes that give rise to consciousness or why consciousness is there. But there is many theories, and most of those theories explain consciousness in different ways, right? And this leaves you with the question of, okay, which theory is right and which theory is wrong, or what are the set of experiments that a given theory can explain versus other, and in an attempt to because very often in science each of these theories develop in parallel. You have like a line of thought that is I think A, you think B. We collect evidence for each of those like hypotheses, but it's often not the case that the theories are actually put against each other. Like when you say, okay, we run an experiment in which if the result go one way, you have more evidence for your theory. If the result go one way, then we have more evidence for my own theory. So we're trying to do that now. And this is what I call like this open science adversarial collaboration. And the idea of open means that all of the results, even the protocols and etc., are open to the public. Everyone can see what we're doing, how we're doing, and why we're doing it. And it's also built on the idea of team science. So the people who actually have the hypothesis, we develop with them a particular experiment. We develop the set of predictions, how the outcomes will be interpreted, but they themselves don't run the studies. It's a different set of scientists, highly experts, that actually do the experiment to try to eliminate bias as much as possible, right? So I'm fairly excited because it's a new model of science in some sense. And hopefully with that, we can also understand consciousness better. So it's kind of like mixes, it's a good mixture, between trying to advance the field, plus also trying to engage into a scientific model that is different from what we do currently, which is more like in the level of the competition and, like where school of thoughts are just in parallel, as opposed to then really trying to actively find out, the source of disagreements, and try to eliminate them, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, so I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, it seems really fascinating. So just before we go, would you like to mention where people can find you and your work on the internet?
For sure, for sure. So this project that I was mentioning, you can find it on the web under, it's called arc-cogitate.com. That's the website that you can go and look into there we explain the whole project, the team that is behind that, and of course my own personal website. I am not on Twitter, so you will not find me on Twitter. But you will find my lab on Twitter, which is NCC Lab. So my lab is on Twitter.
Great. So I will be leaving that information in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Melloni, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
You're very welcome. Thank you, for inviting me and for this hour. It was fun talking to you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila de Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.